Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
It's cold out there. It's the beast from the east. And I don't mean the weather, of course. It is the political climate, which has got everyone dressed for a potentially nuclear winter.
Not since the heyday of the Americans, the truly wonderful ITV series, has the fear of a preemptive strike been more present in Russia. And on the other hand, not since then have more people in Western capitals been in fear that such an attack on them has already begun.
Given that both sides are now just meters apart, thanks to NATO's expansion all the way to Russia's borders, and that thousands of world-ending nuclear warheads are potentially involved, no normal person would be anything but anxious. In the Western media, nobody with a name like our first guest would get a look in, unless he was a party to the prevailing Western narrative. That's why he's on here. He's the editor of Folly and Malice, a truly remarkable book which shows just how long all of this has been going on. He's Marko Gasic, a London-based political commentator, and he joins us now. Marko, welcome on board the Sputnik. It is a truly astounding book. Tell the viewers why they should be interested in what it's got to say.
Well, essentially, it actually deconstructs the fake news of 100 years ago to actually settle the war guilt question once and for all, to show who was guilty. It finds a smoking gun, it finds a non-smoking gun, and it attributes them appropriately. So you find, for example, in this book, that Russia was anything but wanting to have a war in 1914, and that all its advice to its small ally Serbia was be absolutely conciliatory, do not rock any boat, do whatever Austria says, even if it attacks you, don't fight. We see conversely that in Germany, the advice to Austria when the Austrian envoy turned up was, this is a great moment for war, just carry on. So that's the significance of this book.
German war guilt is, of course, part of the British narrative, and that doesn't make it untrue or necessarily true. But the fact that Russia was such a gigantic loser from the war is really impossible to contradict, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Russia was totally decimated by that war. It lost loads of its territory, loads of its population. Millions were killed there. It fought. It was a tragedy for all of the world, as we know. But Russia was particularly hurt by it. But it was a war in which four empires ended, rise of Bolshevism, rise of fascism, rise of Nazism. All these things were phenomena that accompanied that war. So the war also led to another war further down the line in a kind of way. So really the consequences of that war were terrible for all, and not least for Russia itself.
Well, it's the greatest calamity, catastrophe of, arguably, of the millennia, because of the devastation in itself, but the seeds of future wars and conflicts that it planted. And they're not entirely gone now, are they?
Yeah, but there's lessons there as well. For example, in 1914, Austria investigated the assassination of its Archduke, found that official Serbia was absolutely uninvolved, and yet declared Serbia guilty anyway, and launched a war against it, which led to the wider war.
Now, where have I heard that recently?
Well, this is it. Fake news then, and the same principle is being applied now. So now we have a kind of, maybe not an actual war, hopefully never, but we certainly have a Cold War being declared by the Western powers against Russia now on the basis of what appears to be genuinely fake news.
And it's amplified by social media, the modern technology, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, now we have it, it's much more powerful. In those days, the Russians could always say to themselves, well, we've got a powerful army, if push comes to shove, we'll be able to defend ourselves. But now, in a time of secret, of weaponry that we can't imagine, then no one has got that freedom of maneuver, nobody has got the time. First strike becomes very important, and those are the dangers that we're heading towards through the cyber war, through the social media war, into a real war.
Well, you say that you hope, or hopefully, not a real war. But of course, real wars can come about almost by accident. In fact, literally by accident.
Definitely.
Someone could trip a switch somewhere, and a real war has begun. But the First World War, charted here in this book, that wasn't intended either, was it? They didn't intend that it would become an entirely all-consuming, globalized catastrophe. They were just manoeuvring for position, four heads, most of them related to each other, arguing about the spoils in the world. If they'd known then what they subsequently knew, do you think they would have still done it?
Probably not, but that's the general background. But why did a war actually happen? The war happened because in certain moments, certain individuals did choose to take the risk. In the case of Austria-Hungary, that empire, it was very wanting to take that risk because it wanted Balkan supremacy in order to raise its own prestige as a great power. The Germans at that time, for perhaps the only time really, got behind Austria because they wanted continental hegemony. They wanted to dominate Europe. They felt that Russia 2 years down the line would be an entirely different proposition with its program of strategic rearmament, reinforcement and so on. So they wanted to have a war on their terms, and 1914 looked pretty good to them. And
would it have? Because I sometimes hear this narrative now, even from, perhaps especially from Russians in Russia, that if the war had not happened, if the Bolsheviks had not seized power, that Russia would actually have become a rather successful capitalist state with quite significant influence in the continent and in the world. Do you believe that?
Well, certainly industrially, economically, it was a revitalized country. It had recovered from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, 1905. It recovered from the First Russian Revolution. It was a success story. It had a 10% per annum economic growth rate. Its national income was the same as pretty much Britain's. So really, it was a success story happening. Politically, it was a bit of a dinosaur with the Tsarist system, but there was no reason to doubt that it would be a success story. And I think that was the problem for Germany, which was a success story in itself. So in a way, this great power rivalry, Germany was looking at this threat to its own domination in a way that perhaps we might now have a transatlantic power looking at threats to its own domination and trying to take action in good time to stop it. Unfortunately, good time for them is bad time for everybody else.
Well, you see, I think you've stumbled on something here, and this book points the way to it. I often scratch my head and wonder why this animus towards Russia from other Western countries, because Russia is a European country. It is the biggest European country. It is a capitalist country. There's no reason on the face of it, as there was during the period of the Soviet Union, which was an existential threat to the prevailing system here. Today's Russia is not. It believes in and practices the same economic system as then. Why can't they get along? And the answer is because some powers don't like other powers being a rival to them, even if they share the same politico-economic mores.
Well, even 100 years ago, they shared pretty much the same mores and the same attitudes in many ways, which we would perhaps not approve of entirely now. Nevertheless, they had similar, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, they were similarly ruled by a strong ruler, but that didn't stop them viewing themselves as potential rivals, so that doesn't necessarily help.
Despite what the West now believes, it is NATO that moved to Russia's borders, not Russia that moved to NATO's borders. Russia was promised that the countries in its hinterland, from which it voluntarily withdrew, would not be incorporated into the NATO war alliance, and now they have been. And it's the West that are putting sanctions on Russia, not the other way around. They're selling us gas like Billio. The colder it gets, the more of their gas they give us. At quite a decent price and with a guarantee of supply no matter how many times you insult them. So Russia was the offended party then. Don't you think it's also the offended party now?
I do. I think there's Russophobia in the political system in Britain and in America is huge. It's not rational. It really is. I mean, the political elite, there's probably no one in Parliament who'll think differently. Nobody dares to think differently. Russia has been fingered as the other, the enemy, the Orwellian empire on the other side of the situation. So in a way, nobody's got time to listen to Russia and nobody wants to. And this is the problem, because Russia has had a certain amount of patience in 1914, but when you pushed it into a place where it felt it could not survive if it didn't offer resistance, it then went to war. And the danger is, by trying to humiliate Russia, dominate it, create it, turn it into a vassal of Western encroachment worldwide, silence it when you bomb other countries. By trying to do all that, the West is actually creating a situation where the Russians may have no choice but to come back. And when you get that situation, then we get something as in 1914.
You mentioned Orwell. Is this 1984? Is it East Asia has always been at war with Eurasia? Is it about the need for an enemy, the need for, which is proving very profitable to the military-industrial complex?
Well,
and I see in this week's newspapers, the British Army sent a massive shot in the arm financially.
The angrier the Russians get, apparently, the more budget Gavin Williamson gets to allocate to his defence department.
But they've been quite patient about it, don't you think? I think Russia has shown quite some diplomacy.
Well, more patience than I would, I must
exactly.
say.
They don't want this conflict.
No.
They're trying to avoid it, but this conflict keeps going at them. And then at a certain point, when the mugger is coming towards you, the victim, if he can, is going to take action.
Now, as you've covered Austria a lot in the book, is there any significance that Austria is one of the countries that doesn't want to play a part of this tit for tat and expelling the Russian diplomat? Yeah,
some surprises. Austria, Portugal perhaps more surprising. It's not, I mean, the world turns against Russia, the Times said. That is if you ignore Russia, China, India, Pakistan, the Arab countries, half of Europe,
Africa.
South America. Yeah, the world turns against Russia.
Community, the little one. Well, of course, these countries know, for example, South America, there's a lot of countries that have experienced, as it were, the wrong end of Western policy led by the US, and they know sometimes a potentially fake story when they see one, and they're not going to simply be bullied, some of these countries, into saying yes when they know there's clearly a lot wrong with it. Because once you accept that the bully can bully someone else, then next time round it may be coming for you. So there's that. Though I think in the case of Austria and possibly Germany, there may be some restraint because they know what it's like to ultimately, if you aggravate the bear and then the bear fights back, you won't enjoy it. And so I think as you get closer there, there's perhaps a bit more sense comes in. That said, the nearest line of American domination towards Russia, right next to Russia, where NATO is breathing into Russia's throat, as it were, those countries feel they've got no choice but to follow the line that America's now written for them.
Well, look, it's a fantastic book, a great piece of editing, great piece of writing, and I've only flicked through it enough to know that it's an outstanding read. Thanks very much for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Coming up, Kim Jong-un goes to Beijing. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Just weeks ago, it looked like missiles might be flying over the Korean peninsula. The little rocket man and the large orange man were trading insults over Twitter, apparently engaged in a game of Chicken Little just before the sky fell in.
Then, bizarrely, the two men sharing a cheeseburger and Coke on the DMZ was on the menu. And then came the appointment of John Bolton, the walrus moustache warrior, as National Security Advisor.
So, what happens next? Korean leader Kim Jong-un made a very rare international trip this week to meet President Xi in China. What on earth could they have talked about? If anyone knows, my next guest knows. She's China expert, Dr. Jude Woodward, author of The US versus China, Asia's New Cold War. Dr. Jude, welcome back on the Sputnik. This all came as a bit of a surprise. The Western media was certainly caught unaware of it. Even now, if you look it up, they're not saying much about it. What are you hearing?
Well, I think it's quite difficult to judge what was actually discussed, but the significance of it is quite clear. I think it's a very good thing. It indicates, I think, positively, that the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Trump, which has been much heralded, is quite likely to happen. Because I think the explanation for why this visit took place now and so speedily is because if he's going to meet Trump, Kim has to meet Xi before he meets Trump. He can't walk into a conference with Trump looking isolated in the world. He needs to re-establish North Korea's relations with China to give him some leverage in the situation. But secondly, it would be an insult to China, its only ally and longest-term friend, to meet the President of the United States before meeting the President of China. So I think for those are the probable reasons for the trip at this moment, and I think it actually bodes quite well for the idea that there will be talks despite, as you say, the appointment of Bolton, who's the Hawks.
Well, we'll come back to that. It indicates, first of all, that China has not turned its back on North Korea. Quite. Secondly, that Kim Jong-un is not an idiot who thinks he can play the most powerful country in the world entirely alone, realizes that he needs friends and therefore to influence people. These are all positive signs. Indeed, the Chinese president appears to have communicated to Donald Trump, going by Trump's Twitter feed, that the meeting went well and that Kim Jong-un was looking forward to the meeting with Trump. So it's all positive news, really, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed, because no one in the world, I would say, wants war.
Except John Bolton, maybe.
I was going to say exactly, apart from a handful of people at the Hawks in the Pentagon and the White House, but nobody else in the world is in favour of a war in North Korea. Certainly not the South Koreans, who the Americans claim to be primarily protecting. And I don't think the Japanese either, because the chances of significant collateral damage in the region affecting, well, definitely South Korea, which would probably take the bulk of the damage, but also Japan, means that there's no appetite for confrontation in those populations, but there isn't anywhere in the world. So Bolton and the Hawks will try to come back, I think. But I don't think this was played to them.
Based on the pictures and images and videos that I saw, it looked like a very stately visit. You met all the officials, the wives were there. Was it an official state visit, or how should we regard this?
It wasn't. It was an unofficial visit, but it was certainly, from the Chinese point of view, treated as all but a state visit. They treated Kim Jong-un extremely respectfully and gave him all the honour that a head of state deserves. But he was only there for 24 hours, and it was classed as an unofficial visit, so there wasn't quite the level of pomp and circumstance there would have been if it was an official state visit. But I think this is not the central point.
It's very interesting, though, because I saw also that they travelled by train. Yeah. Does it mean something?
Was it Korean? Did he travel by a Korean train all the way to Beijing, or did he change trains? Do you know any of that?
I don't know. I know it was flagged as a green and gold train, but what a green and gold train signifies.
More green and gold.
Now let's come back to Bolton, can we? He, prior to his appointment, should be said, he hasn't said anything since, he wrote in August US journals just weeks before his appointment his case for the legality of a preemptive strike on North Korea. He has been almost the sole, not just on Korea, but Iran and elsewhere, almost the sole protagonist, certainly the main one, of a projection of American military power against those with whom the US is currently at loggerheads. Two possibilities then exist. Either Trump tames Bolton, or Bolton makes even wilder Donald Trump. Which of these two is more likely in your view?
Firstly, the whole administration has taken a turn in a hawkish direction over the last 2 or 3 months, both in terms of the new appointments, not just Bolton, but Pompeo, and across the piece, there's a shift, you can say a shift to the right, if it's possible to shift to the right from where it was before, but in an internationally more hawkish direction. Then you've had the series of announcements of trade tariffs on China. Some of them are posed as general, like the tariffs on steel and aluminium. But in fact, the reality is that virtually everyone has been exempted from these tariffs except China. And then there's the promise of another 60 billion of tariffs. This is a turn in a more hawkish direction. So I think part of the reason for the Kim visit was to play against that and to try to keep the détente, if you like, in Korea on track. And I think it's probably been successful. But as I said, Bolton and the people around Trump are pushing in a different direction. And that seems to be the direction Trump is going.
Now, you're, as I said, a very considerable China expert. Your book is essential to understanding China and the current confrontation with China. These economic measures, these trade tariffs, they're virtually an act of war against China from the United States, no?
It depends what the US does in the end. I mean, note that things have been threatened before, and then when they've come down to it, they don't amount to that much. And there's a 30-day negotiation period on the steel and aluminium, and there's, I think, a 60-day negotiation period on the other 60 billion of measures. China has responded in a very measured way. It's come back. The steel sanctions would affect about 3 billion of China exports to the US, and China has responded with proposed tariffs with again a 30-day cooling off period on 3 billion of US imports to China. So that's it's a totally proportionate response, and it's not engaged in a war of words over it. China doesn't want a trade war. And these measures will actually be very damaging for the United States as well as for China. All the evidence is that trade tariffs play back even more harshly on the population of the country imposing the trade tariffs.
Isn't China looking elsewhere anyway than towards the West for growth in its trade and investment pattern? I mean, one reads of Chinese investment in the most unlikely places.
In Africa.
In Africa, in Latin America and so on. I mean, China has no kind of monomania when it comes to dealing with the West, does it?
Absolutely, but also on the question of the West, China has rather good relations with the EU and with Germany, and the trade has been developing. The whole Belt and Road project would, if completed, Xi's proposal is for complete communications integration of the Eurasian continent, so that trade and exchange between the east and west of the Eurasian continent was continuous and speedy. And so therefore the American economy is not terribly dynamic. And whereas, for example, Indonesia, Vietnam, the countries of Southeast Asia, India, some of the sub-Saharan countries of Africa, Latin America, these look like much more positive.
Dr. Jude Woodward, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So Kim Jong-un travels to Beijing and meets the president.
In a green and gold train.
Yeah, which looks more green and gold. But there's some great captures of the two of them meeting each other. So we asked, what could these two have possibly been discussing? Some great commentaries. Eugene Cook says, hairdressers and Moss Brothers. And Alex Scott says, Dax Wax. 80 Fox, who cares? The mainstream media will take care of that. But for sure it has something to do with Donald and some rockets.
One of the amazing things was the almost dearth of publicity about the visit. It's not as if it's not of great international importance, but I've had difficulty finding any Western reports about it at all.
No coverage.
The Korean fox has been shot. The casus belli has been lost.
Now, Russia, are we on the verge of a nuclear war? Dulce Vida says, would be funny if all this name-calling wasn't so dangerous. it's not hard to see which country has colonized the globe with military bases, funded and armed terrorists all over the world, assassinated the best of the leaders from Africa, Latin America, and etc. And it's not Russia.
I don't know who you could be talking about, but at the beginning of the First World War, nobody intended that it should become the war that it became. Just remember that.
Oh no. Well, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Instagram and Twitter, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.